Hi, it's Mo. It is December 16th, and I have not wrapped up a single book that I've read in December. I've only read 4 books in December so far, so not a lot, and not as many as I would usually read, but we'll come back to that in a second. If you're unfamiliar with my vlog-style monthly reading wrap-ups, these are videos that I do every month where I talk about all the books that I've read as close to when I've read them as I can muster. Obviously this month it's not that close since I'm starting it in the middle of December. I talk about the books for about 5 minutes and I give you a synopsis, tell you what I thought of them, maybe some common themes, maybe if I think you should read them as well. And then I also sometimes talk about the readathons that I'm reading them for, but I also do a monthly Readathon Recap, which is a short video that comes out after this video, just recapping all the readathons that I've read for, some of the prompts that I've read for, and compiling a big long list of readathons. So in the month of December, I've only read 4 books. This is way less than I normally read, but I do want to make it clear that it doesn't matter how many books you read. I think it's worth saying again that if you read 1 book a month, if you read part of a book a month, if you read 1 chapter a month, if you read 100 books a month, you are still always welcome on booktube, and you shouldn't feel bad about your reading, and you shouldn't compare it to other people. I think you should also not compare your reading with your own reading from prior months or what you hope to be reading, because it is a way to discourage you when you maybe are not reading as much. Now, I know in the beginning of December I've had a lot going on. We have a new cat and he's still separated, so it takes a lot of my time going back and forth between all of the cats. I've been working my work from home job. I've had to get the house ready for a visitor. My sister-in-law was here visiting. My husband was away, so I was doing a lot of that as a one-person show for a little while. Sometimes things happen and you don't read as much, or sometimes you get into reading slumps. I am in a little bit of a reading slump, but there's always more time to turn it around. There's always more time in the month. So without further ado, as they like to say on booktube, let's get into the books I read. The first book that I read in December was Claire DeWitt and the City of the Dead by Sarah Gran. This is a noir-style mystery following Claire DeWitt, who is the best detective in the world. She's a little bit of a Dirk Gently. She's a little bit of a holistic detective, which is how her mentor taught her to be. In Claire DeWitt and the City of the Dead, Claire DeWitt has to return from California. She has to leave the wellness area and retreat that she's been on for the last few months to take a case in New Orleans, where her mentor is from and where she studied under her mentor while her mentor was still alive. So this follows Claire on this case. We see every aspect of this case that she's working on, but we also see her methods, her holistic methods, where her inspiration comes from, both from her mentor and her mentor's mentor, who wrote a book called Detection. So this introduces the character. It's very short, plain language, a little bit staccato style noir, but very modern noir. So I love that this bridges the gap between kind of old style traditional noir and new noir, and I love this book. This is a reread for me. I read this just after it first came out, probably in 2013, 2014. I didn't realize at the time that it was like very new at that point. I haven't read it since then because it's Remember December, which is a readathon all about rereading books to find out how you really feel about them, or see what it was you liked about them, or reading them in a different format. I wanted to reread this one. This reread definitely cemented to me that this is a favorite of all time. So I'm super excited to look for and find the second in this series. I do have the third in the series, and I'm not sure if Sarah Gran's going to come out with any other books in this series, but I hope she does. The next book that I read in December was What Miss McGillicuddy Saw, or 450 to Paddington, which is an Agatha Christie book in the Miss Marple series. This is the first time I was reading this one. I'm working my way slowly but surely through the Miss Marple series, and I'm reading them in order, which is rare for me to do with a series in general, especially a Golden Age mystery series. But this one follows a friend of Miss Marple who, as she's coming down to visit Miss Marple, sees a murder on a neighboring train, but because the trains are passing each other, because of delays, they're not sure where this murder occurred, or if this murder occurred, or who this murder victim was. So Miss Marple has to jump right into action, and she does a lot of investigating before the investigation, but she also knows, being a little little old lady that she's going to need help on this investigation, so she enlists some younger, vital people to help her find out what Miss McGillicuddy saw. This is a great one. Classic Miss Marple. We love her. She's funny. She's astute. She definitely always solves her mystery, and usually before any of the youngins get a chance to really know what's going on. I like that this one introduced like a young friend of hers that could definitely potentially have come back in other of Christie's work. I know that a lot of characters in Christie's work do come back around either in other works or in their own stories, but I've only ever really read Miss Marple, and I've only ever really read The Mysterious Affair at Styles, the first in the Poirot novels. Oh, I actually also read the first in the Tommy and Tuppence novels, so I'm unfamiliar with any characters that come back around, but I could have definitely seen this young woman as being a Miss Pinkerton style character for Agatha Christie. Obviously, highly recommend. These you can all read out of order too. I love the Miss Marple stories, and they are self-referential sometimes to earlier in the series, but totally worth reading them whenever you find them. The next book that I read in December was another reread for me, and that was The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. The first year that I was on BookTube, this was my favorite book of the year. It was the first time I ever read it, and I read this at the behest of my husband. He had been asking me or telling me I should read this for a very long time, and for some reason I always thought it was like a war book, and I never really wanted to read it, but this is really a satire and commentary on society and what the future might hold. This book was written in 1965, so obviously the future that they're picturing in this book is not necessarily accurate to our current future. You do have to like suspend your disbelief a little bit because there are some dated aspects of this book, mostly just like not having cell phones and things like that. This book follows Oedipa Maas as she realizes that an ex-lover of her has died, and he has made her the executor of his will, and she has to go down to California where he lived and where he owned a lot of stock in different businesses and different land and things like that, and not only execute his will but find out some of the mysterious circumstances surrounding his life. So this follows Oedipa as she meets various people or deals with people who are already in her life and tries to come to terms with the death of her ex-lover and find a resolution to the mysteries that she sees all around her. This is a very obtuse, surreal kind of book, and I knew that I love it when I read it the first time. I read this for the prompt of read something in a different format, so I ended up reading this again on audio. I did enjoy the audio, but I think I got a little bit more out of this book reading it physically when I first read it. But I love how surreal and obtuse and bizarre this is. I love the conspiracies. I love the connections to the post office. I love the idea of secret communications happening all the time, all over, and I think it's an interesting take on a potential future. I really enjoyed rereading this one, and highly recommend if you're into weird books. The next book that I've read so far in December is The Mystery of Mrs. Christie by Marie Benedict. It is the Christie's Missing Readathon from the 3rd to the 14th of December. It is also Cloak and Dagger Christmas, so I tried to read a Agatha Christie related book as well as some Agatha Christie books during this month, and this is the one that I happen to have. Last year I read The Christie Affair by Nina de Gramont, and I really enjoyed that one, and this year I decided to read the other book that came out right around the same time, revolving around the 11 days that Agatha Christie went inexplicably missing. So this one is told in 2 storylines for the first part. It is divided into 2 parts, although they are very differing in size. So it starts with the manuscript, and those are alternate chapters with the 11 days that Agatha Christie is missing. So 1 day after the disappearance, 2 days after the disappearance, etc., etc. The manuscript portion of this follows Christie in her early life as she meets her future husband Arthur, how they got together, their time during the war while they were separated because he was a pilot and she was working as a nurse. And then the second timeline is following Arthur at their house at Styles, where when Agatha Christie is missing and kind of his side of things. It starts out with him receiving a letter that you're unsure of the contents of for the majority of the book, and throughout the book, he's referencing this letter. And then eventually the two storylines do converge, and at the very end, there is a part 2, which is very, very, very short, where the storylines have converged. So I really, really disliked this book. I didn't think that I could read another book this year that would make it to my worst books of the year, but I thought this book was bad. I don't understand the choices that were made to make a book about one of the most independent and tough, interesting women in history and the history of authorship be all about her cheating, abusive, and neglectful husband. That was a confusing choice to me, and it really made this book a slog to get through. The writing in this is not good. It's extremely repetitive, and although I think this author probably has done a lot of research and does have a lot of ideas, the execution of the writing of this book was not good. It was insulting to the intelligence of the reader at some aspects, and obviously insulting to Agatha Christie herself, and it just felt like a book that somebody wanted to write, but like wanted to do it in a couple of weeks or a couple of months and not put the effort into actually making it. This book could have been a shorter book. It's not a very long book, but because of all the repetition, if you had cut some of that out, if she had had a better editor, if she were a better writer, I think that this book could have been much shorter and more to the point, or fleshed out to be more interesting, but unfortunately neither of those things happened. This is definitely like a women's fiction book, but I think it is the base level patter to the masses women's fiction book, and it really didn't have anything interesting to say about Agatha Christie's time when she went missing. It didn't really have anything interesting to say about Agatha Christie, and I really, really disliked it. So I would definitely suggest skipping this one, but if you want a interesting fictionalized version of the time when Agatha Christie went missing, I would definitely suggest picking up The Christie Affair by Nina de Gramont. So those are the 4 books that I've read so far in December, and when I read some more, I will let you know. Hi, it is Wednesday, December 20th, and I finished 3 more books in December. I finished The Likeness by Tana French. This is the second in the Dublin Murder Squad books, and this is the sequel to In the Woods. So In the Woods follows Rob Ryan, who is on the Dublin Murder Squad, and his partner is Cassie. And this book follows Cassie and Cassie's story, a little bit taking place before the events of the first book, but mostly taking place after the events of the first book. It's not necessarily like a direct sequel, but obviously there are a lot of things that overlap and different characters that we meet in the first book that come into play in the second book. And the third book is about a person from this book who we meet in this book, and I'm sure it's going to be a similar thing. I know that that one takes place more in the past, so I'm sure it's going to have something to do with like the events of this case, or possibly how he met Cassie, or etc., etc. So I think it's a really interesting way to like make a series. This follows Cassie, who was an undercover agent before she went to Murder Squad, and because of the events in the first book, she's now off the Murder Squad and she's working domestic violence in Dublin. When someone is killed and they come to discover this person is using an old alias that Cassie used in her undercover days, Cassie becomes embroiled in the mystery. And that's really all. I mean, you don't need to know any more of that going in. These books are quite long. This book is 466 pages, but they're really easy to get through. The writing is really compelling. The stories are really interesting. They keep you really attached to the characters and the plot and what's going on, so you want to keep reading. The first book, In the Woods, I read in 24 hours. This book I would have read quicker, I think, but I was reading it on audio. So just by the nature of my audio reading, I read it over like the course of a week. I think that The Likeness had a few more parts where the story either dragged a little or you were unclear as to what the motivation for that particular part of the book was, or there were some repetitious parts. So I think that this one probably could have been edited down just like a tiny bit, but a lot of this book is about the idea of like whether you like your life, and if you don't like your life, how you change that. Do you change that by creating family around you? Do you change that by moving house? Do you change that by becoming a totally different person? Do you change it by changing your career? So I think that a lot of this book was Cassie's kind of thinking about that and musing about that with the various people in the book and on the case, and her having to ruminate on those things, but also her having to decide for herself what she wanted to do. It was a little bit slower. There was a little bit more like deliberation in this book, and that definitely wasn't really the case in the first book. I really love these books. I think that Town of French has a super interesting way of using like metaphor and simile and comparing one thing to another that could be considered really flowery and in another writer's hand might be like over the top and annoying. But I love the way that she will, I don't know, compare the light coming in through the window or compare the sound of the crunch of the leaves underfoot. You know, like I just really enjoy the way she does that, and I think that she manages to do it in a way that's not like purple prose or overly written. Like these books are really written. They're like written, but they're not overly written. So I really enjoy them. The next book features a character that I don't know if I'm going to enjoy, but I am excited to find it and read it when I do find it. But I'm not gonna like super seek it out, I don't think. I mean, obviously if I find it at a used book sale or a little free library or a thrift store or whatever, I will definitely pick it up. I'm glad to have like made progress in this series, but now maybe I need a little time before I get to the next book. Let me know if you've ever read the Dublin Murder Squad books, and let me know if you have what your favorite in the series was. The next book that I completed in December was Passing by Nella Larson. This is a reread for me. I read this in 2021 after joining booktube, and since it is Remember December, I wanted to reread a few books that I've read in my time on booktube and see how I really feel about them. This is the first and only Nella Larson book I've ever read so far, but I loved it. I thought it was amazing. The first time I read it physically with this copy, and this time when I read it via audio, and I thought it was really good. I realized later that there's a version read by Bonnie Turpin, and I would have really enjoyed reading that one, but I can't remember the reader of the audio that I did end up listening to. This book is so short, and it's told in two parts with chapters within the parts. This is about two young girls who were friends when they were little, growing up in a rural town outside of Chicago. When Claire's father dies, she is sent off to live with her aunts, although she sometimes comes back and visits the town and the people in it. And Irene, her childhood friend, and Irene's family, they eventually lose touch with Claire, and it's not until many, many years later that Irene sees her again. So this is the story of how Irene and Claire come back together, and this is the story about how Irene discovers how vastly different her life is from Claire's. They're both black women, but they can both pass for white, and Claire has decided to live her life as a white woman. Since Irene did not decide to do that, and since she does not feel like she needs to hide her blackness most of the time, this creates like a rift in any potential friendship that they might have. So this book is super short, and it's just so good, like so well written. You get to know so much about these characters in such a short time. You get to know so much about their relationship as it currently stands. You get to know about how the world they live in works, and then there's also so much good love and tension and friendship and disguises and mystery within this book, and it just is so well done, and I really loved it so much. I enjoyed it very much the second time as well. I think upon second reading, it lost some of the surprise, both in just the greatness of the writing and the enthralling nature of the story, and then some of the revelations as well. But I think that was mostly because I've read it before. I also think that reading on an audio might not be the best way to go because of the language, because of the way the book builds. because of there being some letters involved and other things. I kind of think reading it physically is better. This is such a short book. It's under 200 pages. The first time I read it in a couple days. The second time I read it in a couple of hours. Although I do think you should definitely read this physically, it wouldn't hurt to read it on audio either. But this is definitely a modern classic. Amazing. I do have one other Nella Larson book that I want to get to, and hopefully, after reading this again, I will get to that other one soon. The next book that I read in December was Best of Luck by Jason Mott. This was a short story, short novella, novelette that's included for free in one of my subscriptions. This is the second Jason Mott book I've read. I also read Hell of a Book a few years ago, last year I think, and I liked Hell of a Book. I thought that it was a little heavy-handed. I thought that it was a little over-explained. And I feel the same way about Best of Luck. Best of Luck is about two best friends, and when the book opens, we see one of them holding the other at gunpoint. This book follows these two men over one night as they figure out why one of them is trying to kill the other, as we find out the story of their lives, and as we find out that one has a dark and gruesome secret. So that's all you need to know about this book. I don't want to say too much about this book because it is so extremely short, and I think that this is one that the reveals come pretty quickly and you wouldn't want to spoil anything. But I also think that in the end, there's a little bit too much explanation. There's not quite enough of letting the reader decide on their own what's going on, or letting the kind of horror linger. This is definitely a horror novella. Like I said, I feel a little bit similarly to how I felt about Hell of the Book, and that Jason Mott didn't need to be so heavy-handed in the explanation of the book, and that it might have been better to let the reader come to some conclusions on their own. But overall, I liked it. I'm intrigued to read more from this collection because there's a lot of other interesting writers, Grady Hendrix, and a few other horror writers in there that I'm interested in, a few that I've read before, a few that I haven't. So I will definitely be picking up more of this collection when I can. And I guess I would keep reading Jason Mott. I don't know. Yeah, I would. I think his concepts are interesting, and he's definitely talking about like race in America, and he's definitely talking about poverty and prejudices and things that he translates into horror and speculative elements. So I think I would definitely try another of his books, but I'm not convinced he's the writer for me. Those were 3 more books that I read in December, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is December 28th, and I finished 3 more books in December. I finished Why Shoot a Butler by Georgette Heyer. This was on my end-of-year TBR. This is a Golden Age mystery that I picked up in my local Salvation Army, and I've been wanting to read it because I've never read any Georgette Heyer before. Georgette Heyer is most well known for Regency romances, so I probably wasn't going to pick up one of those, but she was also a Golden Age mystery writer. She was a contemporary of Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers, and I thought this book was interesting. I didn't love it. There were some problematic elements, and I think that this being a standalone didn't necessarily work in its favor as a first book for me, as in like as a new reader. If I had read one of her more well-known series or detectives, I might have gotten a better feel for her writing. But because this was a standalone, I felt that the character development of the main character and the amateur sleuth, who's also a barrister, was a little rushed. This story follows Frank Amberley as he is driving to his cousin, his aunt and uncle's house, and he sees a car pulled over at the side of the road. He goes to ask for directions, but when he pulls up closer, he finds that there was a man shot to death in the car. There's a young woman by the car also, and she tries to get him to leave, but he decides that he needs to go and alert the authorities. When he alerts the authorities, he does not tell them about the young woman who was waiting by the dead body. It happens to be that Frank Amberley is an amateur sleuth as well as a lawyer, and and he insinuates himself in the case, and he tries to figure out who murdered this man, who this man was, and why Frank let this young lady go. It was against his nature, and so throughout the book, he is trying to discover and think about his own feelings as well as the crime. I did enjoy this one, but it didn't have the same, like, oomph as a lot of the Golden Age mysteries that I love do. So I would read another Georgette Hayers for sure. I enjoyed it enough to do that, but it's not one that I'm going to like be seeking out the way I do with Agatha Christie or Dorothy L. Sayers or Mary Robert Reinhardt. The next book that I finished in December was Florida by Lauren Groff. This is a collection of short stories revolving all around the state of Florida. So not every single story is set in Florida, but most of them are, and every story at least references Florida in some way. And the majority of these stories are about women and women's lives, and specifically the anger that women feel and the incompetence that has been ingrained in them and that they feel like they need to overcome. So a lot of these stories are women who feel that they are not able to live in the world the way that they should, feel that they are not able to accomplish things the way that they should, but they plunge ahead and try to accomplish things anyway to kind of buck the system and rebuke the patriarchy and the society that has led them to feel this way in the first place, that has kept them uneducated or incompetent in what they're trying to accomplish. I think there's also a underlying dread in this book of like anxiety and fear and a lack of control that these women all communally have to deal with. So even though each story is very distinctive and even though each woman's character is very distinctive, there is this unifying underlying current of anxiety and dread, climate anxiety and anxiety revolving around children, and then also an underlying current of like anger as well as fear. Anger from fear, anger because of being fearful, but also just anger kind of at a world that lets them feel this fear. I really, really enjoyed this. This was the first Lauren Groff that I read. I also read this for the TBR spin. It was a like bonus spin throughout the year that I wanted to get through before the end of the year, so you can see more of my thoughts on like every story in that vlog, which will be coming out before my December TBR spin vlog, but possibly before this one. So I really loved this. Super glad to have read Lauren Groff. I have Matrix on my TBR, so I definitely plan on reading that, and I definitely plan on picking up more of Lauren Groff's writing. The next book that I finished in December was Dorothy L. Sayers' Whose Body. This is the first in the Lord Peter Wimsey series, and I've read 2, 3, and 4, so I was super happy to get to the first one. This one is much shorter than the other ones. Love this vintage cover. It's so great. I was interested to see like how the character of Lord Peter Wimsey came about, but this story does kind of plunge you right in. Lord Peter Wimsey is already an amateur sleuth. He's already helping the police sometimes figure things out. Vaguely already knows Parker, although they really become friends and solidify their friendship in this book. So Lord Peter finds out that an associate of his mother's has found a dead body in their bathtub, is totally confused about how it got there, has no idea how this body turned up in his bathtub, it's a naked male body, and it's wearing pince-nez, like little glasses, and it's totally confusing. Lord Peter Wimsey runs into Parker when Parker is convinced that this death has something to do with a missing diplomat who also happens to know Peter's mother. I love Peter's mother in this because she is very savvy and she definitely is a very smart character, and he says indulges his whims to be an amateur detective, but she knows a lot more than she lets on, which was interesting about the Georgette Hayers book as well, because there was an aunt character in this that was very similar, and I loved the aunt in this one. So Lord Peter and Parker have to figure out this crime, see if the two crimes are connected, and of course Peter does it with the aid of his right-hand man, Bunter. Silly chaos ensues, but this one definitely did deal with heavier topics of Lord Peter's time in the First World War and his severe PTSD that he's still dealing with. He still has nightmares and panic attacks, and so that plays a little bit of a role in this book. A lot of people don't like this book, didn't like this book, and I couldn't figure out why, because the other Lord Peter books that I have read, I thought were fine. I thought were interesting. I enjoy them. Lord Peter is definitely a character that reminds me a lot of Bertie Wooster, and that Sayers has actually said she based in part on Bertie Wooster. So he is a aristocrat, a dandy, high class, and sometimes doesn't understand the privilege that he has, sometimes does understand that privilege and uses it to his advantage. So I could see that being a turnoff for some readers. It's definitely not like a Miss Marple situation where you're completely endeared to the character. Lord Peter has a lot of flaws. But after reading this book, I see that it's super racist and basically revolves all around some of the characters in this being Jewish, and they're not talked about in a very nice light at all, and there's definitely disparaging remarks. So I think there were probably problematic or racist elements to the other Lord Peter books, but it wasn't that the entire plot hinged on that. So I can definitely see why people didn't like this one. I feel like in these Golden Age mysteries, yes, they get lower marks when things like that occur, but because it's kind of a time and a place, and because of just how old they are, I can not forgive them, but can get past it if the story is good enough. And I could certainly see how people would say that this one wasn't, but because I'm already invested in the Lord Peter mysteries, for me, I was able to get past it. Obviously, this is probably my least favorite of the ones that I've read for that reason, because I do see that it's unnecessary even in olden times, even in the times when those things were acceptable. They are not acceptable now, and it is not really acceptable to encourage that kind of writing, even if it's someone who's long dead. So I completed the first in the Lord Peter, and I will read on. This definitely gives me pause for later books as well, and I will probably keep a keener eye for racist elements in the other books, you know, and if I decide that it becomes too much, then I can stop. So those were 3 more books that I read in December, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is January 1st. The next book that I finished was Love Poems by Nikki Giovanni. This is a book of poetry, pretty small, that I read at a friend's house while I was cat sitting. This is the second book of poetry that I've read by Nikki Giovanni. I really, really enjoy her poetry. I really loved a lot out of this collection. Unfortunately, I won't be able to annotate it because it is not mine, but I did take some photos and stuff of poetry that I really enjoyed, and I did take some footage while I was cat sitting that I might turn into like a little poetry vlog at some point. This volume of poetry is specifically called Love Poems, and I think that this was one that collected a lot of different work by Nikki Giovanni, not that was specifically written as a book of poetry of love poems. So the poems came from many different sources and were on many different topics, and they definitely covered just general kind of love poems, like talking about how much you love someone and what they mean to you and what they make you feel, but it was also talking about familial love and the love of a mother and child. So there was a lot of themes happening. What are you doing? There's a lot of themes on love happening in this one. I really enjoyed it, and I just look forward to reading more of Nikki Giovanni's work in general. I do have one other book of poetry that I got earlier this year called My House, so that might be the next one that I head to. The 12th book that I read in December was Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex by Angela Chen. This is a nonfiction all about asexuality. Angela Chen is a Chinese-American author who is asexual. So this covers her life and a lot about her life and her finding out about her asexuality and discovering that she was indeed asexual and how her asexuality works, as well as many different interviews that she's done with other people about their asexuality and what that means to them and how it affects their lifestyle and the people around them. This book also uses studies studies and articles and other things about asexuality, gives you a brief history of some of the aspects of asexuality, among other things, to kind of discuss this lesser talked about and lesser understood aspect of the queer community. So I thought it was super interesting. That was why I read it. I read it because I am not asexual. I don't know anyone. That's not true. I've never talked in depth to anyone about their asexuality, so there's not a lot about asexuality that I really comprehended, I would say. Like, I understand it, but I don't have a strong comprehension of what it's like to be asexual, etc., etc. So I thought this one was really interesting. I was surprised how much this book was about sex. I don't know why. I mean, I guess that makes sense that when we're talking about sexualities, whether that's heterosexual, homosexual, ace, allo, etc., that sex is going to be involved in it. I just really wasn't expecting that, and I was surprised at how much asexuality, which is the term for someone who is not sexual and doesn't feel sexual, is about sex. Like, I would have thought it would be about the absence of sex or not sex, but it is about sex. And a lot of what Angela Chen talks about is how sex is pervasive in society and how much our society is sexualized, and just around the world society is sexualized, although this does focus almost exclusively on America and Americans. I don't know. I had a lot of thoughts about it. This would be a great one to like read and discuss with people of all natures and sexualities and genders and etc., because there was a lot of people who identified as genderqueer or gender fluid, and there were a lot of people who identified as trans that Angela interviewed. I do think that this would be a great jumping off point for a discussion of not only asexuality, but the sexualization and the sexual nature of society and how we are raised in like a, what does she call it? She calls it like a sexual conformity, essentially. It would never occur to me that there were not asexual people. Like, if you have a person who is sexual or sexually attracted to men, or someone who's sexually attracted to women, or someone who's sexually attracted to trans people, or etc., makes sense that you have people that are not attracted to anyone, that they have no sexual attraction, and that is what makes them asexual. But I guess it didn't occur to me the pervasive nature of sexuality, which we talk about a lot in our society, about how like young girls specifically are over-sexualized, and that there is speeding up that has happened of sexualization of young people over the years. But it never occurred to me that that would affect asexuals so much, and I think that that was something really interesting that came out of reading this book. So I really enjoyed this one. I definitely want to read more books by and about asexual people, and it made me think that I would love to read more books. I mean, I've always wanted to read more books about trans people, but also about homosexual people, and it's just a really interesting topic to like delve into in a way that we don't, partly because it is like taboo to talk about sexuality, even though we're bombarded by it constantly in our society. So I definitely highly recommend this one. This is an easy, super easy, easily digestible, easily understandable explanation of asexuality. So if it's something that you are unfamiliar with or want to become more familiar with, I think that this is definitely a great starting point. And the last book that I read in December is The Panther and the Lash by Langston Hughes. This is the first Langston Hughes book of poetry I ever read, and it's actually his last book of poetry, I think, that he made before his death. So Langston Hughes is a super well-known poet who was writing in the early 20th century, and he writes a lot about the Black liberation movement and civil rights, and about Black people's lives in America, especially like during Jim Crow laws. He talks a lot about like Black oppression and Black identity. He is a poet that you probably know some of his work that has either been used in various things, or other people have written things referring to his work. I have always been really interested in reading his poetry. I think he wrote a couple of plays. I think he wrote one short novel. I think he's written some children's works. So I was super excited when the friend that I'm cat sitting had a copy of The Panther and the Lash, and I decided to read it. I really enjoyed his poetry. I teared up during this poetry collection. I think I teared up during the Nikki Giovanni poetry collection as well, but now I can't remember. So I was super happy to finally read some of Langston Hughes' works. He's definitely a influential and important American poet. So those are the 13 books that I read in December. Unfortunately, I don't have all my books here with me at the moment, so we will come back in just a sec for a wrap-up of my December wrap-up. All my books are behind me. Oy. Okay, we are back with the wrap-up for December 2023, last reading month of 2023, and man, it was a really good one. I think I have Cloak and Dagger Christmas, Christie's Missing Readathon, and Remember December to thank for such a great reading month because I love reading mysteries. It's my favorite genre. It's so fun to read a bunch of your favorite genre at the end of the year. And then I also did quite a few rereads for Remember December, which I don't know if I would have done if I wasn't participating in that readathon. So I'm super happy to have gotten to them. Some of the books that I read for Remember December, some of my all-time favorite books, and books that were my favorites since starting booktube. Super happy to get to those. I read so many great mysteries this month. I read books by people of color. I read nonfiction. I read some books that have been sitting around on my shelves for a long time. I also was able to read books off of my end of year TBR and get some of those out of the way. I read new authors. I continued on in series. I read queer works. I read a book of short stories, and I had a really great reading month. To see more about all the readathons that I participated in the month of December, you can go to my Readathon Recap. I will be going over all the readathons I joined in and some of the prompts for those readathons and what books I read for them, etc., etc. But I do think that December is going to be my last month for that. You can always go back and check those Readathon Recap videos from 2023 to see my big long list of readathons. We'll be on to something new for 2024. Let me know how your reading went for December. Let me know how your reading went for the end of the year. I'm super looking forward to all the reading in 2024. So let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!